Os desdobramentos da crise dos refugiados no mundo. A situação do sistema penitenciário no Brasil. A luta pela abolição da pena de morte. O preconceito em todas as suas manifestações. Temas bem diferentes, mas que têm em comum pelo menos duas coisas: a violação evidente dos mais básicos direitos humanos e a atuação da Anistia Internacional, com denúncias, campanhas de esclarecimento e pressão sobre autoridades. Em um mundo marcado por radicalismos, políticas excludentes e desconfianças em relação ao outro, é cada dia mais relevante a atuação dessa organização global que conta com o apoio de mais de 7 milhões de doadores pelo mundo e que está presente em 150 países. Em recente visita ao Brasil, o secretário-geral da Anistia, o indiano Salil Shetty, falou ao Milênio.
I'd like to start this conversation with a sort of a historic question. We know that Amnesty International was founded in the early 50s by a British lawyer who wanted to take out of prisons two young Portuguese that raised their glasses to freedom in Salazarist Portugal. Mm-hmm. Looking around the world, you travel a lot, I know. What are some of the causes that you think that if you would raise your glass to, you are in risk of being imprisoned as well?
Well, unfortunately, 55 years after Amnesty International was formed, we still have many issues where if you raise your voice, you could be put in jail, you could be, put away. Take the case of Edward Snowden, who really exposed a lot of the wrongdoings of the US government, and now he has to stay away from the US. He is really at risk if he, goes back there.
Segundo o advogado dele, o asilo temporário vale por 1 ano. Esta imagem de uma TV russa mostra Snowden de costas deixando o aeroporto, onde permaneceu numa área de trânsito nos últimos 39 dias. Snowden saiu num táxi comum para um local não divulgado.
But there are many places, unfortunately, in the world where if you question the authority or the misdoings of the government or of corporations, you could even be killed. But you talked about the history of Amnesty International, and I don't think Peter Benenson, the British lawyer who created Amnesty International in 1961, would have ever dreamt that 55 years later we would have more than 7 million people across the world making Amnesty International, which is probably the largest global people's movement for human rights.
Fighting for human rights, when you're looking at a dictatorship, it seems quite obvious and quite easy. But how about fighting for human rights in democracy, with elected leaders, with legally elected Congress and everything? How is this fight? Is it more difficult to fight it in a democracy sometimes?
See, the assumption we're always made is that elections are a very sort of real and meaningful way of holding governments to account. Unfortunately, that is a dream that has been destroyed. Often governments who are elected think that gives them legitimacy to actually be unaccountable. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we have a serious problem today. I mean, we've had this in Brazil, we have it in India, in my country, we have Turkey. These are countries, and Philippines now. Philippines has a landslide victory for President Duterte. And he has already killed more than 2,000 people in a matter of months in the so-called war on drugs. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons why we're having this whole, anger and frustration across the world is because of unaccountable governments and leadership. And this is not just about governments, but also about corporations.
Talking about the rise of a very right-wing ideology, and ideology itself, and the fight for human rights. Usually, the fight for human rights is linked to some leftist idea, something like that. In Brazil, it's also linked to, there's not a consensus, but lots of people tend to think that the fight for human rights is a fight for protecting the rights of criminals. Is that something that happens all over the world? Is that something Brazilian? How do you see? Does Amnesty International have any political affiliation to the right or to the left?
We have no religious, political, economic affiliation of any sort. Our only purpose is to end human rights violations. Now, on the bigger question about how is human rights perceived in countries like Brazil or my country, India, where you have a very big aspirational middle class, here, there's fundamental contradictions because all of us want our own human rights protected. If you say to me that, I will not have the right to raise my voice or, I will not have health or education, I'm going to fight that. But when it comes to somebody else, then, we start asking these questions. Are you defending criminals? So we all our countries in the developing world want to become like the United States, like Europe, but we don't want the rule of law. You can't have shortcuts to human rights. Unfortunately, it's not possible.
There was a time not too long ago where Amnesty International was very much criticized because it's based in London and it was a bit far away from the problems themselves, far from the field where things were happening. But this apparently has been changing for the last couple of years, or even a bit more, some 4 or 5 years. You've been there as secretary-general since 2010. Was this perception right, first of all? And, for example, you're in Brazil for 5 years now, this office is here in Rio. Is this a trend, a path that you're going to follow to be more in the places where things are happening than only in the base in London?
Absolutely. I mean, Amnesty Brazil is a great example. We've been here for 5 years, and I'm very proud about what we've managed to achieve in these 5 years. I think we've put, for example, the whole issue of young black lives on the national agenda. And Amnesty Brazil stands for exactly what all Brazilians stand for. We want to see a Brazil without human rights violations. We want to see a Brazil which doesn't discriminate against black people, against indigenous communities, against women. We want to see a Brazil where the right to peaceful protest is respected. A Brazil which will stand up for human rights defenders.
Sobre o Brasil, a Anistia faz uma longa lista de denúncias.
Caso citado é o de Eduardo de Jesus Ferreira, menino de 10 anos que sonhava em ser bombeiro. No ano passado, ele foi baleado por PMs na porta de casa no Complexo do Alemão, no Rio de Janeiro. Policiais tentaram mudar a cena do crime, mas foram impedidos por parentes e vizinhos.
Thousands of people have already joined Amnesty Brazil, So, in fact, many Brazilians may not be aware that they can be part of Amnesty. In fact, Amnesty is owned by the people who are our members and activists. So, I'm very bad at pronouncing this properly, but, we have if you want to join as a volunteer, as a donor, however, anistia.org.br. How do you say BR?
BR.
BR, yeah, exactly.
Anistia.org.br. E vamos aproveitar que o Salil está dando essa deixa para olhar um pouquinho as campanhas nas quais a Anistia Internacional esteve envolvida no Brasil, especificamente, nesses últimos tempos.
Chega a rir de nervoso, comédia, faz chorar.
$30 mil jovens por ano são vítimas de homicídios no Brasil. 77% são negros. Queremos ver os jovens vivos. Participe. Acesse anistia.org.br.
Talking about subjects that are very much in the news, war in Syria and the refugee crisis. Sometimes listening to some politicians and some generals, we have the impression that people think that they can solve one problem without tackling the other. How is it possible to make these two battles to go together?
So, this is another example. If you take the refugee crisis that the world is facing, this is the largest refugee crisis we have seen since the Second World War. 60 million people have been pushed out of their homes. 22 million almost are refugees, which means people who have crossed their borders, fleeing from war and persecution. And I have spent time in the last year in the camps, in the border areas of Iraq, of Syria, of these countries. And I can tell you, Marcelo, that I've spoken to women, men, children. Not one of them have told me they want to go to Europe.
É galpão, é armazém bem grande, armazém abandonado, que eles usam para se proteger do frio. A maior parte dorme aqui, a estrutura aqui. Muitos não dormem nem em barracas.
If you want, just open border. If you can, so give us some place to, live. For sleep, we have no shower. I've been here from last 1 month. I didn't have shower. 1 month,
Guess where they all want to go to? They want to go back home to Syria, but they cannot go home. Now they're fleeing from that situation, and the majority of these people, if you take Syria, 95% of the Syrians who have had to flee Syria are in the 4 or 5 neighboring countries. Globally, 50% of the refugees in the world are in about 10 countries. Most of them are poor countries who account for less than 2% of the world's wealth. The richest countries in the world, in Europe, the United States, are signatories to the Refugee Convention, but completely violating what they have committed to. So it's a big problem, but it's less than 1% of the world's population. We have seen through Canada and Germany that where you have leadership, this problem can be solved. What we need is a system of global responsibility sharing.
So if we take the refugee crisis as the biggest human rights problem of 2016, and I think there is a consensus that it is, what would you say was the biggest victory of the year in the struggle for putting forward human rights importance in the world?
No, I think we've had many, many victories. I mean, I think the biggest victory across the world is that today there's no place to hide. If even in the case of Syria, Assad's father, the current leader's father, had done a lot of atrocities against people, but nobody heard about it, But today people hear about it and people take action. There's a lot of brave people who stand up. You take a case of South Korea today. Every Sunday you have, almost like hundreds of thousands of people out on the street standing up against unaccountable government. And that's where I draw my inspiration from, that people will not accept nonsense anymore.
Então, vou querer saber do Salil Shetty, secretário-geral da Anistia Internacional, o que a gente pode esperar para 2017 na luta pelos direitos humanos e também a visão da Anistia Internacional sobre o Brasil de hoje. Isso daqui a pouco no próximo bloco do Milênio. O Milênio está de volta, hoje entrevistando Salil Shetty, secretário-geral da Anistia Internacional, em visita ao Brasil. Your physical presence here with an office, it's 5 years old, but of course we always have your annual report and talking about Brazil, about South America. How is Amnesty International's view on Brazil today? Our biggest problems, our biggest challenges, and maybe some initiatives that gives you hope about what we can achieve as a country?
Contrary to what I've been hearing when I'm here and what one reads in the media about the reality in Brazil, I'm actually very hopeful for Brazil. I know we're going through a difficult time right now, but I have immense faith in the people of Brazil. I'm not sure that I have the same faith in the leaders in Brazil. So the leaders have disappointed us. There's no question about it. Both the previous leadership in the government from the past and the current government who are, they're proposing things which are very disconcerting to us, whether you're talking about a cap on social expenditure, a new mining code, repealing the family statute, the new anti-terrorism law, which we think could criminalize peaceful protest and actually attack social movements and leaders from there. Right now we're going through a difficult patch, an uncertain patch, but I think Amnesty Brazil is now very much a part of the fabric of this country. It presents a hope to young people, and I hope young people, because it's one thing to be angry and outraged or to be disappointed, but then you need to take action.
Estamos conectados. Por isso, quando a nossa voz se levanta para exigir direitos, uma grande mudança acontece. Somos mais de 3 milhões de pessoas defendendo os direitos humanos todos os dias. Junte-se a nós. Junte-se à Anistia Internacional.
So if you take something like public security, and there's a real issue here because ordinary people in this country are affected by crime, and they're right to say that, they need public security. And it is a responsibility of the state to protect its people. But public security is not a problem of the favelas. It's not a problem of black people. We are in this cycle of violence and drugs in this country, and the solution can't be to take shortcuts and to kill people. Of course, there has to be law. There has to be, people have to be restrained if they're going to commit crimes. But I don't think there's a shortcut solution to simply buying more weapons, and repressing these populations. I think we have to work with them to find solutions. We have to find ways out of this. The solution is not to have conflict and anger and division. It's to come together and find solutions.
A bit earlier on, you mentioned that Brazilian leaders failed the country, and I think it would be fair to say that for lots of people, even our parliament failed us as well. Our elected representatives in parliament failed the countries, and then in this vacuum that was created, we saw the judicialization of the country, like the lawyers and judges being very prominent and very proactive, even in a political way. What do you think of this for a democracy as huge as Brazil?
No, I mean, Brazil is a relatively young democracy, and in some ways we can say it's still going through a democratic transition, and the sort of three branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary have been having a different, at each point, the power balance between the three has moved, up and down. I think that it's very important that all of them have a very equal balance of power. That's how the system is designed. Right now, you are seeing sort of judicial activism and a sort of muscular judiciary because there's a vacuum on the other sides.
O ministro Marco Aurélio decidiu afastar Renan da presidência do Senado em resposta a pedido do partido Rede. Marco Aurélio disse que a permanência de Renan no cargo, depois de virar réu, compromete a segurança jurídica. O Supremo abriu processo contra Renan pelo crime de peculato.
Eu acho que há 9 dias, com uma pauta pré-definida aprovada pelos líderes, você afastar por decisão monocrática o presidente do Senado Federal, nenhuma democracia, sinceramente, merece isso.
But at the end of the day, democracy is not about these three branches of power. It's about whether people are benefiting from the enormous wealth that this country has, the enormous innovation and creativity that this country has. So the system we've had so far has failed the people. It's not just the leaders, but the system is, just to say that I go and put my ballot, I cast my vote once in 4 or 5 years is simply inadequate. Young people are not ready to accept this anymore. That, I vote for you and then you can do whatever you want. That's not an acceptable option, which is why we're looking for real-time accountability. The right to participation is 24/7, and that's what Amnesty International is about, holding leaders to account.
And if you try to look forward, I think that, it's very difficult to predict anything in this world of today. But you, as Amnesty International, when you look for 2017, what do you think will remain the biggest challenges for your work? And also, where do you look for when you're looking for some hope to keep going, moving forward?
One is what we already discussed, which is a massive movement of people and the impact it has, because along with the refugee movement...
There's no sign that this is stopping for the foreseeable future?
No, not at all. I mean, because the underlying factors of conflict and bad governance and human rights violations will not change in 12 months. So, we've already launched a campaign called I Welcome Refugees, and that's a very powerful campaign.
A gente não pode tolerar que seres humanos continuem arriscando suas vidas em embarcações precárias, rotas inseguras e alojamentos desumanos. Os governos têm que se unir para compartilhar a responsabilidade sobre essa crise e chegar a soluções efetivas.
But the second issue, which we didn't talk about much, which is the kind of core of our second global campaign, which is on protecting human rights defenders. Because one of the things which has happened across the world in this whole process of bad governance, the growth of conservative governments, etc., is that those who are defending human rights are under attack like never before. And it's not, when we think about human rights defenders, we think about maybe NGOs or human rights activists. But it's not even restricted to those people. It's journalists, it's academics, it's students.
And this is true all over the world.
It's unfortunately a phenomenon we're seeing in far too many places. I was recently in Central America. We talked about homicides. Some of the highest homicide rates in the world are in Central America. And the issue here about protecting human rights defenders is fundamentally about fighting impunity. Because if you take a country like Honduras, there's 90% impunity. So nobody is ever convicted. And often behind this is the issue about police and security forces. I mean, in this country, you have massive impunity of the security forces as well. But unfortunately, the police are both, killing and being killed. So we have to address both sides of the problem. But so our other big focus is about the use of all sorts of repressive laws against civil society and human rights defenders. This is going to be a big campaign for us in 2017. Brazil, unfortunately, also does not have a very good record on protecting human rights defenders. And, I don't want to make it sound like a technical term, human rights defenders. It's people who stand up for human rights. Those people are under attack, because when you stand up for human rights, effectively you're holding somebody in power to account. And those in power don't like that.
And just to end our chat here, I will insist, where do you look for when you're looking for hope?
You asked about the hope, yeah? And I think that's very important. I'm glad we're ending on that note, and because I travel, I have the enormous privilege as the head of Amnesty International to spend time in the indigenous community, villages, with women's groups, with refugees, with the victims of human rights violations. And I can tell you that, you go there and you talk to these people, they are fighting against, unbelievable odds, and you go to, and you find women who are standing up against rape, against sexual violence at huge personal risk. And this, I can assure you, is the human spirit. This is never going to end. No government can kill that. No corporation can kill that. That is true in Brazil, it's true anywhere in the world. And I can end on that absolute confidence that the human, the arc of justice, always, it tends towards humanity, towards freedoms in the end. So I'm sure we will win that battle.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.